continuing to talk about watercolor and specifically the wet into wet process that I like to use for landscapes. The process demonstrated in the paintings over my shoulders. It doesn't take long when we have a conversation about watercolor and wet into wet for the word control to come up, especially in discussing it with folks who are in their first couple years of trying to experiment or maybe even master this technique. It's usually in the form of a phrase, I can't control it. And I want folks to know that this is not a new problem. It's not a new challenge for the learning curve of wet into wet watercolor. I've got a vintage Elliott O'Hara book here, Watercolor Fares Forth. It was written in 1938, and I love these old books. I just love the way they're written and the approach they take. Watercolor Fares Forth has a very esprit de corps type title that we can all do this and accomplish it. But I would point out to you that his previous two book titles are printed on the right below the main title. The sequel to Making the Brush Behave in 1935 and Making Watercolor Behave in 1932. So I guess prior to Watercolor Fares Forth, Elliott O'Hara took the approach of watercolor being an unruly child that we somehow have to conquer. But I think we all feel like that at times and have, particularly when we're starting, have varying degrees of frustration about how to get the mixtures and the pigments to work properly to produce the effect that we want. And it does take some time and it will come with practice. But one of the things I want to mention is that when we say I can't control watercolor, I think a more accurate term or more accurate phrase might be I'm frustrated and I'm overwhelmed and I can't create the conditions that I need to get watercolor to do the work. Back to old Ed Whitney, he said, watercolor is trying to help you every step of the way, end quote. We just tend to get in its way. And I want to talk about a learning model that I'm always trying to find ways to help my participants experience some success, particularly in these early phases of trying to control the water and pigment mixtures. And I wanted us to talk a little bit about that today. Specifically, the concentration of our pigment in relation to water and how much we use in certain portions, in certain areas of our painting. For example, the difference in a sky versus a middle ground versus a dark band of trees. Like you'll see the dark band of pine trees in that bold watercolor wash behind me. And I will tell you mention that this little model and this technique does apply more to my style of bold wet into wet watercolor, which uses fairly intense pigment, but it seems to be something that is attractive to a lot of folks, and they want to know, how do I get rich, bold color in my watercolor without totally losing control of the washes and getting into trouble. I mentioned in an earlier video that we did a while back, one of the things that folks inadvertently do is that they introduce far too much water onto the surface of the painting way too early. And what happens is it begins to float the pigment and everything turns into a rice patty and sort of mushy. The colors begin to get dull because they're mixing on the paper in sort of a random fashion rather than blending into each other in a controlled fashion. So let's look at a couple of these issues and let's look at my little model that I came up with. What is a conceptual model? One of the things that I decided to do in a way to try and explain this to folks is to find something personal that was visual as well. And we all are familiar with a compass, north, south, south's down here, west, and east. And my challenge was, how can I help folks get a feeling for the proper mix of water and pigment so that they feel more in control of their painting at various stages, and so that they can replicate that sequence when they need to within a certain part of the painting. And so what I did was I came up with this little conceptual model. What is a conceptual model? Well, it's something that typically is personal. I consider myself somewhat of an outdoorsman, at least I used to be. And a compass is familiar to me. I've relied on one quite often in wilderness areas. So I decided to use that as my diagram. A conceptual model is often visual. It's something that I can replicate in my head at a moment's notice so that I have a framework to go back to. And our purpose here will end up being helping you control washes. And that's the whole gist of what we're doing here. I've taught learning skills at Appalachian State for over 20 years now. One of the things I've found is that college students dealing with trying to learn complex processes such as biology and chemistry, gas cycles, Krebs cycle, things like that, if they can make something about that learning sequence personal, and if they can make it visual, then that information quickly comes back to them as a framework, and that's what we're going to do here. So for example, if I look at what makes up the body of a watercolor painting, particularly one of my bold into bold washes, we're looking at primarily strong middle value, okay? Value, V-A-L-U-E, value that falls into the range of these wonderful orange and red and bright greens, and maybe even the backdrop of the mountain. So one of the things we want to consider is that I'm going to call our bold middle value conditions true north, okay? And given that 80% of this painting, or somewhere in that range, probably falls into middle value, I'm going to say that we want to be on the path to true north most of the time. But know that we're going to deviate into some other directions to get the result that we want, to end with a unified, hopefully very successful painting. South, east, and west. We'll talk about south in a little bit. But I want to show you what I consider to be the set of conditions that we're going to refer to as true north. What I take is about an 80% pigment concentration of water to pigment. So in my approach, I have a very dense intensity of this Prussian blue that I'm using, okay? I know when it looks right, and I make sure it's well mixed, and I'm going to say that this is true north. Add maybe just a slight amount of water. Now this is going to dry several steps lighter on the value scale than it appears right now. Now, once I have mixed up that puddle of true north color, which will result in middle value, thereabouts, if you're a participant in my class, I'm going to pass this palette around, and I'm going to ask you to look very closely at this puddle, to touch it, and I'm probably going to even ask you to go to a piece of watercolor paper in the back of the room and take my 1-inch brush and paint a stroke with it. Because I want you to experience this condition. I want you to know what it feels like. I want you to know what it looks like when you put it down. I'm not going to ask you to taste it, okay? But I want you to be familiar with this concentration. So therefore, I'm going to put you through experiential learning so that you know personally what this looks like and feels like when you put it on the paper. Now, I can replicate this with any of my palette colors in terms of the concentration, the amount of pigment versus water. I can do it with rose madder, I can do it with cobalt, I can do it with ochre. Naturally, some of our colors have limitations in how deep in value they will go, such as yellow ochre or yellow. So we're not going to get necessarily a middle value from every color on our palette if we use this true north analogy. Yellow is going to probably go down to a 3 on the value scale at the most. But we're taking Prussian blue as an example, and you see now that's already drying as more of a middle value. Now, that's going to give us a good body color for a large percentage of the painting if we stay with our true north direction and keep on task. However, let's look at a sky. We certainly aren't going to need that kind of value in a sky. So I'm going to say, let's move to the east a little bit. And the east is wetter Is wetter a word? We'll see. Somebody will let us know if it's not. And because we're adding water, we're diluting the value, so it's wetter and lighter. Okay? And an analogy there could be, as of the last couple days here on the East Coast, it's been very, very wet. Typically, the East is a wetter place to be than out west, Arizona, New Mexico. We can consider dry. Just another sort of little mental framework you can form there. So, one of the things I want to do is I want to now slightly dilute with a brush full of water my Prussian blue and come over here and create conditions for east, which might be used in a sky, might be used in the body of water that's flowing down through the middle of that painting. And it gives us a framework to switch gears. You know, a conceptual model like this isn't anything tangible. It's simply a way of thinking about a process. And it's a way of thinking about a process that hopefully will give you a framework so that when you feel overwhelmed and frustrated because all this mess starts happening on your paper, you're going to be able to say, as some of my participants have said, oh, wait a minute, I've gone too far east. And you're going to be able to back up and go back to your initial concentration and get your groundings and get your bearings again. So very simply, it's a way of thinking about getting through the process. You know, when we start a wet into wet watercolor, oftentimes we're pretty good about gauging this in the initial phase. We pay attention to that water and pigment mixture, but what happens is a few minutes into the painting, we have all these other things running through our head. Value, am I getting the right value? What about my color harmony? Wait a minute, the side of that shed doesn't look right. It's askew, it's not drawn correctly. So what happens is we stop paying attention to these relationships on this damp paper, and we subconsciously or we're unaware that we're loading more and more water every time we make a brush stroke, and then all of a sudden we have a mire of all different colors running and floating and creating a dull, lifeless mixture. So this is just one way to sort of remind ourselves that there can be a method to the madness. Let's take a round brush now and let's go to the west, and I'm still using just Prussian blue. So I'm reducing the water in the west from my true north conditions, meaning that I want a very dense pigment mixture, more dense than the original true north mixture. So when I get that and I apply that, all of a sudden I have my deepest, darkest value possibilities with this particular pigment. And immediately, if you squint your eyes between these three sections, you should be able to see those distinctive value differences in those three swatches. So going west, I remind myself, is the ability to deepen the value. Now, where would I be able to use that in the painting? Particularly in the details, the calligraphy like tree branches, and some of the actual little tributary that runs down through there. We're going more into the west area. So to review, a majority of your trip on this watercolor is going to be your true north frame of reference for your pigment mixture. As you get into lighter areas, skies, bodies of water that have a reflection, or maybe a light being reflected off a barn roof, we can think of east. We've got to wet down that solution a little bit more so that our value becomes lighter, brighter. And then when we come to the point of creating our darkest shapes, we go to the west and intensify that pigment concentration even more. So it gives us three distinctive value ranges to be able to paint within. Now, everybody wants to know about south, and we know that, I couldn't come up with a really clever analogy about south, but we often refer to, and I don't know why, being from the south, I'm not sure that this is a great positive thing. When something goes south, that means we've lost control and it's gone badly. So when we think of south, what I use as the analogy there is the ability to lift out and to remove the true north conditions from the paper. So south gives us another arrow in the quiver and a tool and technique to come back in and say, wait a minute, I can modify what I just did. I can turn south and recover this painting. I don't know, maybe that doesn't make much sense, but it seems to work for me. Let's talk about how we might apply our compass conceptual model to an actual painting process and look at the steps we might go through. I've prepared a number of little puddles over here that match our conditions of true north. I've got an ultramarine with the correct concentration, and as I mentioned to you, I would show this to my participants and have them actually take a brush and feel what that concentration is like. I've got a couple east puddles, a yellow ochre and a cobalt puddle, which are significantly higher in water value there, so that we're going to go for a lighter value, a looser wash in a sense. And then I've kept my Prussian blue here in a rather dark, deep west type of conditions. Now, I've also got a little alizarin crimson there, which I've left in a very intense form, which we might use as part of that dark. You might ask, how is this really different from the typical watercolor approach of teaching light, middle, and dark values? And you know, in many ways, it's not much different at all other than the concept of it. And what I see as being different is it gives you the ability to gauge when you need to change direction or if you're out of your realm. For example, if I know that my middle ground mountains need to be true north in value and I see that I'm getting they're much lighter, then I have this kind of incentive to switch gears and go in another direction. So there may not be, in theory, a lot of difference between those two models, but in how you approach the thought process, there seems to be some significance there. So let's look at taking a east approach for a lighter value area in a landscape, and I'm just going to quickly demo some landscape shapes in here. I'm using yellow ochre for some sky. Now let me also tell you this paper is set up to emulate the conditions that I normally would have in a wet into wet painting of being damp to the back of my finger but not saturated or by any means sloppy wet. So that prepares the surface properly for the wet into wet technique that we're going to use. So I've got a little bit of yellow ochre in there randomly in the sky. I'm going to take a little bit of this watered down cobalt blue, bring that into the sky area. So in a sense, I'm beginning in the east, thinking lighter value, high water content, and we'll throw just a tiny bit of wet rose, rambling rose, I believe, in here just for some diversity. And we can let this flood and flow a little bit. Now you see that because the paper is very damp, the surface is damp, I'm getting nice gradation and color flow just in this little swatch of sky area. And if I want to diversify that little red area, I can put a little more of my cobalt in there to give it sort of a purplish cloud. As long as my paper is damp or wet, I have the ability to mix and meld the colors together without any negative consequences, blossoms or floods being created. Using my 1-inch Magic Dragon brush. Now we've got the nice semblance of a sky. Let's come into here now and go to our ultramarine, which I prepared as a true north mixture of pretty intense color, about 80% pigment, 20% water. At least that seems to be a good rule of thumb. And ultramarine is a blue pigment that will go down fairly dark in the value scale. Take off a little of that extra water at the base. Don't think I've got it quite as thick as I need it. As I mentioned, I want my students to actually feel and touch and see what this rich middle value feels like on the paper, particularly on damp paper. Now this is a little bit wet here at the bottom edge, so I'm going to start a little lower. And you should immediately see some value differences between that east approach and the true north mountain here. And that is occurring by paying close attention to the pigment concentration and paying close attention to not introducing more water onto the surface of this than is necessary. This is the thing we forget about. We pick up the pigment and we come in with too much water in the brush because we forget to pull water off of the base of the brush. And so we end up getting our paper more saturated than it should be. If I wanted to come down into this lower area and create a lighter middle value for a foreground, then I have the ability to combine my east puddle with my true north, pick up a little of both, and I can use a little bit of burnt sienna in there. Still pretty high water content, but not as high as in the sky. So now I've got a set of conditions where I've got a true north pigment mixture, I've got a east wetter blend of pigment and water, and then I'm down here in sort of a hybrid between these two for some foreground shapes. Just a way to think about value, water, and pigment concentration. If I want to diversify this mountain shape, this is a good time to do it. And I could come in with some burnt sienna, which being a reddish brown, it's going to neutralize that rich blue ultramarine a little bit. And while this is still wet, I have the ability to pull in some shapes into this mountain ridge so that it gives it some dimension. Can even go here with a little yellow. Do a little greening in that mountain shape. And now I could look at taking a round brush and bringing in some of that deepest west value on the compass. Thick, dense pigment mixture here. This is probably a little bit too wet of a phase to do this, but we'll go ahead and let you see sort of the value difference you're able to create. Yeah, we're getting way too wet up there in the top, but we'll not take the time to dry today. And by going with that deepest mix of Prussian blue with not too much water, I immediately can establish significant value differences. Let's just get real creative and come in here with some alizarin. Alizarin is also a red that will go quite dark. when mixed with Prussian or phthalo green, it'll go almost black, a blue, deep, deep blue-black with the phthalo green or Prussian. So in short work here, we've given you an idea of how this type of model can be incorporated into just a way of thinking about your values and about maintaining the proper amount of control within your pigment mixture so that you're not experiencing that frustration and anxiety that comes from having no framework to gauge this around. I hope this might be helpful to you, and as I mentioned earlier, find something personal and create your own learning model or conceptual model to help you feel like you're making progress and staying within certain boundaries when you're trying to tackle this subject of wet into wet watercolor.